All right, in this lecture, we are going to discuss Locke's approach to the state of nature, which I'm going to refer to as a kind of a relational account of the state of nature, as we'll discuss here in a moment. So the first thing that I want to mention is what exactly the thesis is for the treatise on government. So Locke tells us that we can think of the thesis here as an attempt to establish the origins, aims, and extent of legitimate government, right? So we want to try to figure out how does it form, what is its purpose, and when might it dissolve? Like what is its extent, right? So those are some things that we'll need to think about because that's the sort of central thesis of the reading. All right, so to get to the state of nature, I want you to think back to Hobbes and to some extent Rousseau, and in a way to kind of compare Locke's approach to, say, for example, Hobbes' approach to the state of nature. Clearly, Locke was inspired by and influenced by Hobbes' view of the state of nature. In fact, he uses the same sort of philosophical move to argue for his version of a social contract theory, right? His version of a constitutional government. And for Locke, this philosophical move basically involves appealing to this hypothetical sort of historical account of the origins of government, the state of nature, before we have any cities, before we have any governments and so forth. But there needs to be a caveat here because while Locke does endorse that sort of Hobbesian philosophical approach or argument, there are some important differences that we need to pay attention to as well. So first, unlike Hobbes, who again was kind of an atheist, for Locke, God plays a central role in his understanding of the state of nature. And we can think about this in terms of Aquinas and the natural law theory that we talked about previously. Locke is adopting the same sort of position, right? So the state of nature is much like the Garden of Eden, but it's not a perfect harmonious bliss that we somehow get out of and then become corrupt like what we saw with Rousseau. Instead, for Locke, God gives us certain rights that we all share in equal and in common, right? So it's a kind of an egalitarian approach to the state of nature. And that's because God gives us to us. God designs the world in that way. It's his purpose, his plan, his will, right? But, however, like Hobbes, the state of nature is total and absolute freedom. We have the freedom to do literally anything we want. But that comes with no security. We don't have the sort of security that you might think would be needed in order to protect whatever it is that we hold valuable, right? So it's similar to Hobbes insofar as it's total freedom, but no security. But unlike Hobbes, it's not a state of perpetual war, right? So remember, Hobbes thought that the state of nature was a brutish, terrible place to live. Locke doesn't think that's the case. And the reason why is because for Locke, we're not just mere selfish creatures. We have a tendency to be selfish, but that's not who we are at the most fundamental level. Rather, for Locke, at our most fundamental level, we are rational creatures. We have a capacity to reason. And that's similar to Aristotle, what separates us from all sorts of other creatures, right? So it's not a state of perpetual war and suffering because for Locke, he thought that, well, our rationality would lead us to try to make certain agreements or certain ways of getting around whatever wars might be at the edges of our social environment, right? So it's not a state of perpetual war because we're rational. And we are not so good, we're not so rational that we cannot live without a sovereign of some sort, right? So he thinks that we are rational. This will keep us from entering into a perpetual state of war, but we're not so good or so rational that we don't need to have some sort of security. And so, again, that's the reason why, much like what Hobbes says, we come to form governments, come to form social contracts or agreements in order to provide security for our rights and our possessions and so forth, right? The other thing that I want to call to your attention to is for Locke, this state of nature is not merely some hypothetical thought experiment. We're not merely being asked to imagine the origins of government. While that's true, we are thinking about the origins of government. Locke thinks that the state of nature might exist even right now, right? So it's not a historical or a geographical relation. Rather, the state of nature involves any relation that is outside the security that's provided by the sovereign. So think about how this might work. There's a couple ways we might think about how this would work. On the one hand, I might be, at a bar somewhere. Maybe I'm outside of the bar in a parking lot, and I might get into a fight with someone, right? And so, insofar as I get into a fight with somebody because maybe we've been drinking all night or whatever, then it's not clear who is in the right. Did I throw the first punch? Did the other guy throw the first punch? Was there some words exchanged? It's just not obvious. Maybe I have one story and the other person has another story. And so since there is no way to provide a certain kind of security in that situation, then that might be a kind of a state of nature where we are both in a situation where we have a lot of freedom, but we're also in a situation where we have no security. For Locke, that would be a kind of a state of nature. There might be other situations where there's states of nature. Geographically speaking, there might be places where the territories are not well defined. And so there are people, different communities that are sort of trying to figure out where are the boundaries drawn. Think about how this might happen with regard to the Ukraine and and Russia. Right, so Russia's thought are in the process of trying to take over certain parts of the Ukraine. And so you might think that there are territorial disputes there, and insofar as there's territorial disputes, they are in a kind of a state of nature. Likewise, you might think that there's a state of nature that can occur between sovereigns, right? So if you have one sovereign community, let's say it's the United States, and some other sovereign community, let's call that Iraq. Well, since there's no secure sovereign that rules over both of those communities, then those communities might be potentially in a state of nature. Insofar as they, there's no rules or regulations that apply to both of them. And indeed, that's often the case that when you have a war that emerges, right? And so for Locke, he thinks that that's a kind of a way of thinking about the state of nature that applies even to today. And if that's right, then the state of nature is not merely some hypothetical or historical or geographical relation. Rather, it's any relation that falls outside of a specific security that's provided by the sovereign or any sort of a sovereign government. And so with that in mind, I next want to turn our attention away from the state of nature and instead to start thinking about some of the other issues that are going to be important. The next issue that we're going to discuss is slavery.